Hello? Hello?
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good. I guess we can wait for a couple more people. Here's Jesse. Hello, Jesse.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, looks like we've got a couple people. I don't know if Brian's going to come today. I know that Sam said she couldn't make it.
Yeah.
So,
I think she's volunteering or something, so
yeah.
it's cool.
Here's Brian. All right. So, how's everyone's week been? And I guess Jesse can be included in that. I was wanting to hear from the interns, but Jesse can also discuss his week as well.
Sure. I mean, I've been very busy. I'll say more later, but I've had a
Okay.
really busy week, but
Yeah.
I'm good. How's everyone else doing?
Yep, same. Busy.
Yeah, your volume's very low, Brian.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Um,
Oh. Yeah, so Brian was busy. About Amanda or Sadna?
I've been good. I did not get that much done since the last meeting. I guess that's not true. I helped Jesse with the presentation. At least I tried to help.
yeah.
Um,
No, you did. You very much did. And the blog post as well, which is, uh, I just got. I'll finish that up like today or tomorrow, but that did not fully get realized. But you definitely contributed to that and the presentation as well. So thank you for that for sure.
yeah, I can take another look at the blog post too and see if I can do more. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
it's been a good week. I've been continuing to read this Grossberg book. And it's pretty interesting. I'm only on like chapter 2, and it's a long book.
Yeah.
The first chapter was like it was an overview, but it was just like a little bit of a lot of things. There was not much organization to it really. So chapter 2 feels like it's actually starting to get into his project more. So that's been interesting.
Now, I think you are directly I think I connected you and Johan versus like via email, but just to say, like, if you have any questions at all, please reach out to him, or you can even comment on their videos because I know he has a bunch of videos and he's pretty good about uh, responding and stuff like that.
Okay, cool. Good to
So,
know. Yeah, I
um,
have his email address.
it just like I think you know this, but just to anyone who knows it, Johan was a former student of Grossberg, and the video series we're talking about is Johan's YouTube channel, which is like Neuro Logos, and he got a few of his people in his cohort, or people at least people who went through things with Grossberg or around Grossberg, and they kind of went through like there's a lot of they're going through what their experience was with him, and then also their understanding of what he probably meant by his book. So it's a cool thing to do. And if you have any questions about those things, we can get those asked to Johan or other people. So that's a cool thing if you want to do that. But no, that please you don't have to like say anything today about it. But if you ever want to talk more about what you're finding or it's what they said, because there's really cool things. Like I don't even I remember like art, like the ART thing, but I don't really know. I don't like if you ask me right now, I don't know how to talk about it very well. And there's a bunch of other stuff that Grossberg came up with, and I think one thing that stayed with me in the discussions that I remember about that is Grossberg kind of fit into this time period where a lot of his ideas were not able to be fully fleshed out and tested in the way that we maybe can do now. So there's a lot of interest in trying to maybe consider his ideas in a modern light. And because he's kind of in that era before computing is what it is now, but he's still doing stuff now. So it's kind of that. There's a lot of older stuff that came up, a lot of the classical things, or even like earlier cybernetics that is in that period of time before, sure, like the time, the before time of some things. So anyway, did you want to say anything else, Amanda, or should we open up to other folks who want to say things?
I'll also add that I've read a few of his blog posts. A couple of the ones on representation, and it's a great philosophy for someone without a philosophy background. I wanted to send it to some of the people who I knew from the grad program.
Yeah.
Very very well written.
Yeah, that's why I really like. I aspire to be as well written as Johan is, so definitely relate. Okay. Anyone else have updates they want to share, or how they've been this week? Sana?
I feel like I've gotten some pretty decent work done this week, which is nice to say since it's been a little slow for the past couple of weeks. I've been slowly working my way through this mind map that I've been building, and I feel like after looking at some of the mind maps that I've seen on Google and just other versions of how people express it, I realized that I wanted to take a sort of different direction based on the connections that I've made. So it's been nice seeing this kind of build into something big, and it's kind of like the thing that I talked about a couple weeks ago, where it's I somehow always end up in little wormholes when I'm making these connections, and I'm oh, this is interesting, and then trying to find articles or research based off of that. Recently I found a few articles based on brain emotion learning. They're the computational intelligence paradigms, or they're these learning models, and I've just kind of been looking into how that is used to solve real world problems through AI, and different theories on emotion, and understandings of it, and how to connect that with the rest of the mind map, and where I am in terms of different articles that also talk about it. So it's cool to see this being built up. Also, I don't know if you guys knew about this, but I just recently found out about this this website that's technically not legal, but it gives you free access to pretty much any article that you're looking for without having to pay for it. It's called Sci-Hub. I feel like I'm just recently finding out about this, but that was cool because there were a lot of points where I just couldn't access certain things. So I reached out to one of my lab members, and they gave me this this website for it. So it made my life so much easier knowing that I can access a lot more than just having to go through the process of seeing if my school has access to it. So that's been nice.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's the tips of the trade, I guess. Finding out about things like that. So yeah, and I how you go down rabbit holes. I appreciate that aspect of it. That's something that I think all of us do. To try to find little areas, because you have these little niches that you can find as you're going along, and they're very interesting, and sometimes they lead to new things, new insights. So I'm glad that you're working through that process.
Was there a specific mind map that you are building, or knowledge map that you're referencing? Excuse me. And then I had another question, a general comment, yes, that's basically, the Sci-Hub is sort of that website, and there's also LibGen for other things, but also if you're not sure, or anybody has any requests for things in general, a lot of us have access to things, so we can also, if you need an article of any kind and you don't want to, or you're just unsure about how to get it to, you should ask Bradly and myself, and we can also find it if you're unsure. But yeah, that's. I'm glad to hear all of that too, Sadena.
Just to answer, well, thank you for that, by the way. And to answer your other question, um, I mean, like I've like not anything specific in terms of like the mind map goes, but like I'll try to see if I can, because it's on my like it's on a different screen right now, and I'll see if I can send that through this Slack, just like to give me an idea of like what this looks like. Um,
Sure.
it looks messy, but it's also like it makes a lot of sense to me in a way, where it's like key points that
No.
I've taken from other articles help me find like new ideas that again like I wouldn't have like really pondered upon until like I started making the mind map and like looking into specific niches or like different layers that go into um, like the ideas that they talk about.
Yeah, I think it's that's actually kind of why I like what I'm trying to do with like Obsidian MD and my implementation of Frontier Map, which has been a little bit on the back burner, but the concept's pretty much the same. Of like, I think especially for learning, honestly, I think organically making something yourself that is not dependent on outside structure, but just you, and it kind of like has to be very idiosyncratic. And like you can take things and dress them up, and that's kind of what we do with like deliverables if you want to make it an article or a presentation. Like that's kind of an output of the thing. But like when you're just doing it yourself, it's very like intimate to your own thoughts and reflective of your current, like what you know at the time, and you have to build off of it. And it's not it's very like organic, and I think that's sort of something that like is, it's almost like there's a comfort with that you have to get used to, because a lot of how we're taught and educated, or at least how I was taught and educated growing up, didn't really encourage that the way that I feel I've learned to embrace it now. So I just feel like that's actually really important to really diving deep and stuff, and like, especially when you're doing interdisciplinary stuff, especially when you're doing things you don't really know. I think that's really where it's at. And I know we talk about like epistemological directors and stuff in the lab at times too, but I kind of imagine, I mean, what do you kind of see it that, has it been like that for yourself too, Bradley, or how do you see that as evolving for yourself?
Yeah, you definitely want to adopt your own style, whatever you feel comfortable with. So, sometimes people feel comfortable with having like a formal naming convention. I had an advisor where, he classified everything by like category, and you can do that, but you can also like, you want to make it so that maybe other people can pick up where you left off, or you can remember where you were 6 months ago if you have to drop the project for a while and come back to it. But to develop your own style is I think allowable. I would encourage it because imposing some sort of scheme on people is kind of onerous. People work in certain ways, and but I definitely think having like the mind map, finding sort of mapping out this territory is really what you want to do, and how you get there isn't so as important as getting there. Now, that being said, if we want to make a mind map, if we want to revise the mind map, that would be great too. To have it like where we have a convention for, like almost like a map where you have a legend where you say this is, this aspect of the literature, or you might color code things. There are ways to organize it, and this is just for your benefit too, as it grows and as you go on, to have like a layout. So when you come back to that mind map in 6 months, you can say, "Oh yeah, I know what's going on here." But I mean, I think it's great that you're getting into it, and don't worry about like the structure of it right now. You can make revisions to it as you go along, and just make it like make sense more. As you learn the larger landscape of the field, or what the area that you're interested in.
just like one more smaller thing. I feel like I'll definitely take up the offer of getting this revised because I feel like there are a lot of points where like having a second set of eyes to look at it and just like explain that idea more would definitely be helpful in making those connections.
Yeah.
But also definitely just like looking at other resources and then like a direction, I guess, into like figuring out where to go from like steps X, Y, and Z.
Last week I was going over the systems diagrams, and those are notorious for having to revise them constantly because, as you saw, like I was trying to figure out where things went. So, like as you learn more about things, you say, "Oh yeah, that's obviously can be grouped somewhere else," or, and that's the sort of how I think a lot of things go when you're building something from like, no knowledge to more knowledge. It's like you're incorporating connections and you're making connections, but you want to be a little bit deliberate about that. You can get these huge, messy, piles of spaghetti where you have like lines everywhere, and then you don't know where. It kind of gets confusing. And the one thing you want to try to avoid is getting confusing. Having things that are confusing and to you again, like 6 months later, or just kind of like, because one of the points of a mind map is to look at it and make insights like, oh yeah, that's grouped in that cluster, or that's part of this other thing, and to be able to make that connection, and instead of just having like a list of references with tags, which some people like, but it's not as powerful as like something like a mind map. Jesse, were you going to say something? Or?
Oops. No, but we can. I'll say more afterwards. But would anyone else like to, Ryan or Nirali? Would you like to say anything? Or even you too, Bradley, if you have updates. But the interns, if you're off.
Nirali had an update for us. Or Brian, I guess.
Or Nirali, if you were about to go. I don't have much of an update. I did run into Grossberg yesterday, though, in some reading, which was very interesting.
So. All right.
More about that.
So you're doing a lot of reading, or going through some references?
Back in reading land and trying to finish up the presentation for the New York Celebration of Women in Computing.
Okay.
It's really exciting, but nothing that's exploded at me as being really exciting has come up just yet.
Well, yeah, it's great. You got to keep reading. And, just keep making connections. And like, I said, everyone has their own style. So people, I guess, are diverging here. And that's great because, you're kind of developing your own sort of pace and getting things digested. And okay. So if that's it for updates, thank you, Sadena and Amanda and Brian, for your updates. So this, go ahead, Nirali.
Hi.
Hi.
I watched this YouTube playlist on the human brain. It's from MIT, OpenCourseware, and I learned of how the brain has a different algorithm for face recognition and object recognition, which I didn't know before. And the professor, at the end of the lecture, she teaches how we don't really need data to infer certain things. We can just do that on the spot. Like we can take hands and two faces and see which one is more difficult to perceive and differentiate. So, is it the texture? Is it like the way the lines are organized, the face lines? So that was interesting. And so the algorithms are different for face and object recognition.
Yeah, that's something that I don't know if we've talked about it too much in the group, but yeah, that's very true. There's a facial recognition aspect of the brain. So there are certain cells that people think are tuned to not only faces, but famous faces. So like if you see a face a lot, you can recognize that face. And, it's like the hypothesis is that we have, you know, evolved this ability to see, first of all, our members of our own species, but also like, people who we see a lot. And that face, we have a lot of muscles in the face. There are a lot of configurations the face can take. Just recognizing the face, immediately is much more efficient than having to break it down into pieces and recognize the shapes. So yeah, that's great.
Yes, and I also read about mindfulness in robots. So, so like for how AlphaGo, the move 37 was the major move in leading in Lee Sedol to win the game. So perhaps if like while playing AlphaGo, if the machine had taken a moment of pause and calm, like not calm down, that is what humans do, like they take a deep breath and figure out how to play the next move. So maybe that's what machines can have to like mindfulness.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds interesting. Thank you for that.
Oh,
Amanda said something about propagnosia, which is face blindness, and that's true. We have some people are face blind, so they don't have that ability to see faces, and it's not clear whether that's like a lack of that those cell populations behaving the way they should or what. But yeah, that's definitely a thing that is a disorder. Jesse.
there's if you're interested more in the brain facial recognition areas and stuff like that. I forget if anything. I forget who did what, or how much is still linked in the tutorials and materials. But for NeuroMatch Academy, the summer school that NeuroMatch, for those who don't know, NeuroMatch is this organization that runs a conference series and then also a summer school and is focused on computational neuroscience. And they also offer a deep learning course in the summer school. And I think for the first NeuroMatch Academy, I was involved in a project. I think I switched off of it, but for a while, I think I was involved in a project specifically about that area of the brain and how to sort of test it. And they had some data sets they were using to do that are available. So if that's an area that anyone's interested in, rummaging around some of the NeuroMatch stuff, or mention it to Bradley or myself, and we can go through that with you or try to find it. So that's a really cool thing to do. And I have a lot of like, as a side thought, and we can follow up on this later if anybody's curious. I have a theory or set of ideas I'd like to flesh out with in terms of some of the facial recognition. Sounds so strange, but yes, that part of the brain and face, in terms of like a lot of social, and maybe it's more like neurocognitive stuff. Oops. But I think there's a lot of interesting things with social cognition about faces that are. I think there's sort of an interesting focus on a observer looking at an observed, and okay, I'm identifying it and denoting this thing. But I think there's something, and this kind of ties to some of Avery's work as well. I think there's also I think it's a two-way street in so many words. I think there's a lot going on in terms of what someone else's expression means about who you are in the social context. So more about that some of the time, but I think there's a lot of interesting things in that area. Really cool. Okay. Was anyone else have any other updates? Or I have things they'll say, and I think I'd ask Bradley too. But any other updates before that happens?
Yeah. About the face, they call it, I guess, face processing is the area that's the official term for it. But there is a lot of nice social neuroscience that can be done on that, and understanding, what faces mean between individuals and expressions and things like that. So, yeah, that's a nice area. I'd like to see more about that.
There's a lot, like my first research project in like affective computing was a lot about facial stuff, and that's still a big thing in terms of like especially getting like AIs to interpret nonverbal cues and I there's a lot of murky waters about predicting things like people's sexual preferences and people's criminal potentials. Like there's a lot of like, if you go in certain directions, there's a lot of weird stuff in that area. So that's something that's come up in some of the ethics team discussions too. So just there's the science and there's applications and there's question applications. So there's just a whole arena around this that's an interesting topic. Okay.
You were gonna do something.
How's my week been? My week's been super duper full. It kind of just a lot of things have come up in and outside of the lab, honestly. But it's good. It's just I'm so glad that it was a bit of a snafu situation with part of the presentation, but it went off, and thank you really for kind of helping me with that in terms of the video link. I recorded the video beforehand because I thought Ashley was going to be presenting at a different time, and then when I could present, I wasn't available to present, so I'd use the recording anyway. It was quite a little weird, but we did it, and I think both of our presentations at Embodied Intelligence Conference went well. I think there was, positive response to them. I finished my Diverse Intelligence Summer Institute application, which was really cool. It's a little strange because we don't know who the faculty is this year, and I kind of feel like they maybe told people a little bit sooner last year. But last year there were people like Michael Levin, Judy or Judith Fan from UCSD, who's I kind of would really like to do research with her because she's focused on cognitive tools and drawing and how we use tools as a means to augment our cognitive space. I really like her work. She's really interesting speaker. She's really talented, and I like how she talks about stuff. Also, Joanna Bryson was there. Joanna Bryson had a really interesting keynote. If you did, I don't know. Did you want to talk more about the conference later, Bradley, in general?
Well, I wasn't going to get into the. You could talk about the conference program in general. I want to talk about our stuff, but.
Okay, I didn't get to watch a lot of things. Maybe I'll briefly talk about it later. But Jenna Bryson is someone I met fittingly at Princeton Envision a few years. I think my first year I went, she was there, and she kind of helped me change my trajectory of what I wanted to focus on because I didn't know anybody who was so. The first person I met who was natural and artificial intelligence and really clear about her approach as being not stuck on one particular angle, and she was at the same time super interested in regulation, super interested in talking about AI ethics all together, and unabashedly doing so really articulate, really brilliant. And so she was doing stuff at Princeton and doing stuff at somewhere in Scotland. I don't know if it was Edinburgh, but could have been. Anyway, she's a really interesting person, and her keynote was really good. I caught most of it, and she covered everything I just mentioned. She covered AI ethics. She covered regulation. She's really interested in the regulatory efforts, especially in Europe. she covered, you know, she has a really wide ranging set of topics that she kind of helps bring them in. She's a nice nexus for things. So I would check out her work. I recommend her in general. And she was at Dizzy a couple years ago, and I think Dizzy will be very competitive this year, and I don't expect to again. But I applied, and I think also Jenny from Plot Twisters applied for the storytellers portion, which is a little bit more like art and design focused than just like super duper academic focused. But yeah, hopefully that happens. That's later in the summer. The other thing is, I think my next most immediate thing for me is New York Celebration of Women in Computing. And that's still open to contributions if anybody wants to get involved with that. I don't know if Erin will be here today. She's messaged me now. Erin's working on a log.j4 and open source stuff. I think Brian's working on something. You can let us know where you're at with that later, Brian, if you want, just to kind of see where you're at. And I know Bradley's doing a little bit of something. I think it might be nice also to talk. Were you going to talk specifically about the Google Summer of Code stuff in your talk, Bradley, or was that separate to that?
I think the slides I put some slides in the Slack, and that was sort of the it's that project. So it kind of walks over what that project is or what it involves, and then I don't mention the Google Summer of Code project directly in there, but I do kind of go over some of those parts.
Okay, sure. So there's and I'll talk more about this a little bit later, but that's kind of my main thing. But then after that, I think, and once again, that's that event I'll be attending in person, like April 8th and 9th. So after that, the outlook for me, and this has been a little bit discussed, but there'll probably be a shift of some of my focus to some virtual and extended reality things that seem to continuously be coming up. I know Bradley mentioned some things in Rockwire, and I have yet to really look at that. Bradley can talk more about that later if he wants to. But I will be getting some equipment very soon. I actually have to just buy it today for another group that I'm working in, and I haven't had time to do that. I haven't had time to buy fun things for myself. It's so busy, because it's like I can't just buy this thing. So, yeah. And beyond that, there's some interesting, like, I don't know if I should say collaborations, but potential collaborations with Plot Twisters and Jenny stuff coming forth. If you don't know what Plot Twisters are, just check out their website. I don't know if it's plottwisters.org or Plot Twisters, and just for like Jenny Liu Zhang, LIUZHANG. And there's some things coming down the pipe with that. And I think the mentoring program will also be a focus ahead. But it's sort of like right now, it's just New York Celebration of Women Computing, and then after that, I think there's going to be Google Summer of Code, which I've heard. I'm a mentor in that project for our project now. And you get, if anybody wants, like, I'll put it this way: I'm on the mailing list for the mentors, and their discussions are interesting. It's sort of like a lot of people have said they're getting a lot less turnout than they have in past years, which is very interesting because it sounds like it's really competitive in other areas. Like making yourself an organization is what we try to do. I think that was extremely competitive because they just opened that up. Everybody wanted to do that. But some of the other, like, it's really interesting to hear who's saying what's happening and why. I have like zero context. This is my first ever year on I don't know anything about it. Maybe Bradley can speak more to that. But it's been interesting to kind of being like, oh, you're a potential mentor on the project, and here's the discussion about it, and it's like, okay, interesting. Were you gonna say something?
Oh, I mean, it's yeah, that mailing list is very high volume, as you may have guessed. So it's but yeah, I think this year, there's been a lot of flux in the last couple of years on this, and I kind of wish there were more programs kind of like it, because it's a nice program, but it's very competitive. And then if we could have other programs where we could kind of distribute these, have that one project in different baskets, it would make it a lot easier to move things forward. I don't know, like the organizational application. I think it's really competitive. I never got a answer on exactly the numbers of how competitive it was, but yeah, we tried to do that and we didn't get it this year. We'll probably try next year. So I mean, if people are applying to this project, and I may make a little slide, sort of an advertisement for the New York Celebration of Women in Computing slides that I have now. I'll just put one in, and I think it's a little short notice because I think the applications are due on like the 17th, so it gives people like 10 days after that announcement. But I've had a lot of people contact us about this project. So if you're watching the if you're watching this meeting and you want to know more about the project, go to the neurostars.org site. It's a discourse server. Register there. Go into the GSOC projects, and I think we're 23.1, and that's our project. It's either 21.1 or 23.1. It's the open source AI ethics or open source ethics. I can't remember. That's not the title though. But so there are two parts to it. It's 350 hours, and you have to do both parts. But I think the different parts, are sort of complementary. So it'll require people to do two separate things within that time period. So if you think of 350 hours, it's over from I think it starts in May, it starts in May, and I think it goes through the fall to, I think, November. I don't know exactly when it ends, but so it's a fairly long working period, and so that's for that project. So I just wish that they had more projects like that for open source, because it's nice. To go through these things, to have different baskets to fund it and to get people money and to get them engaged. Now there's they do have a community period during the GSOC projects. So that community period I found to be very valuable. I've done I've mentored for, I think this is going to be my 6th year mentoring. So I've done this a lot. And one of the things that I found really useful is this community period, where people are encouraged to engage with the community, to engage with open source material. So I've done a lot of stuff where I've done some lessons on open source, and I may do that this year in the group here, where you'll be learning about, how to build open source. Basically what you're doing in GSOC is you're creating a project, you're creating an open source, and then you're making it open source, and having to build a full application at the end of the period. So, but that requires people to think ahead and say, I want this to be open source. I want it to be a project where people can go back and download it and use it and modify it later. And GSOC doesn't really allow for that, because it gives people sort of the impetus to finish a project, finish basically a version that runs, but then it stops. And one of the things we've been having a little bit of an issue with in some of these projects is that, they're nice code. They do a very nice job. It's able to run. And then we're stuck on version 1. And we want to go to version 2 or version 3. And we can't, usually open source projects require a maintainer. And the maintainer is the person who sits there and says, we're going to, if people come and they want to do something, they want to make a change to the program, I can review it to see if it fits within the standards of the program. We've had some of that in DevoWorm, where we had a former GSOC student do some maintaining. So they're maintaining the software. Sometimes there's security issues you have to fix. Sometimes there are bugs that you have to fix, where other people will fix bugs and you have to review them. So those are all sorts of things that aren't really covered under GSOC that sort of are like the afterlife of that project. The other thing is that I think there are a lot of things you can learn about open source. And I say this because I've been developing some course materials on open source recently. And so these are this just basically tells you how to start off and start your own open source community. And so that community is very important because you're building some software, and a lot of times that software exists in a larger context. So it could be we're building a agent-based modeling software. And that agent-based modeling software, we're going to make a community where people are going to maybe do things with the software. They're going to be users. They're going to be super users who really use it a lot. They're going to be people who want to modify it. They're going to be educational components to teach people how to use it or how to modify it, or maybe just to use it in education. And so all those things, you have to build a community around that. And so one of the things I like to do in the community period, but it's only 2 weeks, is to give people a primer on how to think in that way or how to build those sorts of things. And so, I think that the program, the GSOC program is nice. If we don't get accepted this year, which is likely, we don't get any students that are funded because they have some constraints on the funding, and it's competitive within being accepted as a project within an organization. It's a kind of a weird organizational scheme. But if we don't do that, we'll still probably continue with the project. We'll probably go through and try to do some things. We won't be constrained by the schedule of the program anymore, so we can do things at our own pace. And then we'll probably have this open source aspect to it, where we teach people about how to do open source and build open source communities and all that. So Erin said, cool, Bradly, thank you for doing this. You're welcome, Erin. Welcome, Erin.
Hey, Erin. We were just finishing going around the room doing updates or kind of how they've been the last week. So you want to say anything about how you've been? I don't know if it looks like you're only writing in the text box. So, okay. But yeah, good to see you here. And
Okay.
What is that it for this? What was the next thing you wanted to cover?
Okay. Next thing I wanted to cover is I wanted to go over, maybe we'll talk about the EI workshop a little bit. Jesse talked about the overview, and there are some good keynotes. There was a sort of a focus on soft robotics this year. So embodied intelligence is intelligence that's embodied in some sort of morphology. So, we think of embodied intelligence, we think of maybe robots, where you have an AI within a robot, and the robot has a body and it's moving in the environment. Sometimes you think about maybe the environment itself, where things are moving around an environment, and it's embodied in that world. So if I put it in a world where there's, a lot of objects versus very few objects, that affects the learning rate of my algorithm. I mean, we think about deep learning or machine learning. We think about input data, and we give it some data set. In embodied intelligence, you do it a little bit differently. You consider the body that the intelligence is located in. So it could be the human body. It could be a soft robot, which is where it's made of materials that are pliable and what they call compliant. And then there are, regular robots. So there are all sorts of different ways you can embody a system. But that embodiment is important because it allows the intelligence to move around the environment and explore. It also allows for there to be a body that interact with the environment. So if you you're in a triangular body versus a human body versus, some sort of ball, like, BB-8, the robot from Star Wars. Those are all like the way the agent moves, the way it behaves. It depends on that body. So the body is important. And so that's what the conference is really about, all those sorts of things. There was a preponderance of soft robotics, and there was a lot of robotics because the people who head up the organizing committee, I think, are roboticists. But in any case, there's a lot of work in humans and in animals that's also very interesting. They had a lot of stuff on like different robotic models. They had a lot of stuff on like haptics and proprioception, which I appreciated because I think there isn't enough emphasis on that. There were a lot of tie-ins to virtual reality, which Jesse mentioned, and this is something we may be doing more of too, is going into like talking about virtual reality, not as like this nice gee whiz sort of set of visualizations, but like some of the deeper issues. And I think we've talked about some of those in previous meetings. But there are a lot of issues with embodiment and with, like interacting with virtual objects versus real objects. There's augmented cognition, which is something else. So there are all these different issues we can do or work with on that in that front. And they really, I think, mash nicely in with a lot of the cognitive science interests of people that people have here. So I look forward to that. And I've done a lot of work in VR, and I know the field fairly well. So we can talk about that in upcoming meetings. So I want to... Oh, was that...
Oh, hey. I thought for a second I was going to come back in. I don't know. Were you still talking about the conference, or...
Well, I was going to get into the specific talks. I'm going to talk about the one that I gave with you and Angela, and then you can maybe talk about the one that you did. So let me share my screen.
Yeah, sure.
And this gives you, I think, a taste of what embodied cognition is about, or embodied intelligence. So I prepared a Medium post for this. You can see my screen here.
Yep.
Yeah, so this is on the Lab Medium, and this is a talk that we originally gave at, there was a workshop last year on cognitive offloading, and it was about, it was more of a psychology conference, a CogSci conference, a lot of people doing stuff with humans and animals in this idea of intelligence offloading. And intelligence offloading is this idea that you basically, instead of storing everything in the brain, you store things in the environment. So, for example, in spatial cognition, you use landmarks. Those landmarks give you information about the environment. You can build a cognitive map of the space in front of you, but it's not enough because you need cues from the environment. So you need cues about where left is or where right is. And if you did this in a room that was totally blank, a void, like usually they'll have like a room with white walls and nothing inside, a white floor and a white ceiling. So you can't differentiate anything. You would find it very hard to navigate that room, because while you know where left and right are, and you know kind of your orientation in space, you don't have any cues. You don't have any external cues to hang on. So it's very hard to navigate. Similarly with mathematics, people will use calculators, they'll use an abacus, and it's a way to use a placeholder for computations that are bigger than like 2 plus 2. So you'll have like people maybe adding and subtracting maybe a list of 20 numbers. You can't really do that in your head effectively. You need to either write it down or use a machine to do it. So this is where intelligence offloading comes in. This talk was about neurodevelopmental embodiment of intelligence offloading. And so this was something that, goes back in the literature, at least to Andy Clark, who did this in around 2000, or maybe in the late 90s. And he had this book, Being There, Putting Brain, Body, and World Together Again. And Andy Clark is by training he's a philosopher. He's a cog scientist. He's done a lot of stuff in cognitive science, and one of his interests is intelligence offloading. And he gives this example in the book of the bluefin dolphin. And this is the bluefin dolphin swimming. And one of the things that bluefin dolphins do to augment their swimming capacity is to use these vortices of water. So you can see this vortex, this air bubble, which is a vortex. It goes around the bluefin dolphin, and the dolphins will use this to power their swimming. So they're augmenting their muscle activity by using these rings, swimming through them, and then it uses the hydrodynamic potential around them to move themselves forward. So this is a nice feedback loop between, sensory motor control and the sensory environment, using that environment to augment your performance. So, one of the questions is, how does this get selected for in evolution? But how does this get expressed in development? How does a bluefin dolphin learn how to do this? And when do they start doing this? And, so those are the questions we want to know. Briscoe and Gilbert give another definition of cognitive offloading in their paper Intrinsic Cognitive Science in 2016. And they talk about a definition that says use of physical action to alter the information processing requirements of a task so as to reduce cognitive demand. So this is where you have it's physical, it's information processing, and it deals with this issue of cognitive demand or cognitive capacity. How much cognition can you do at one time? And this has a couple themes. One is embodiment and action, so physical action. The other is this idea of development plus externalization, so altering physical action, altering information processing over time. And then this cognitive demand, which lead us to this idea of trade-offs. So trade-offs are interesting because, it's basically where you have, say, like a developmental system. And your developmental system requires a certain amount of energy to reach its full potential. It requires a certain amount of information processing to learn to reach its full potential. But sometimes those things are constrained. So sometimes you have an energetic constraint on your learning or on your physical development. Or you have, you're in a sparse environment where there's very little stimulation. So they have these experiments where they put rats in a cage where there's no stimulation. And then they put rats in a cage where there's a lot of stimulation. And they can see a very marked difference in the neuroplasticity of those rats. And so this has an effect on brain development. So, but a larger way to look at that is to think about that in terms of trade-offs. In other words, if I have one of these, constraints in development, if I don't have as much energy or if I don't have as much stimulation, what am I trading off? I have to make up for that in some way, if I can. So, there are different ways that can happen. And one of the things we're proposing here is that in the brain, if a lack of energy, the brain doesn't grow as big. When the brain doesn't grow as big, to match the cognitive capacity of your peers, you have to externalize more. Furthermore, if you don't have a lot of stimulation in the environment, you can't necessarily, maybe you can't externalize as much. So you might have more investment in sort of these innate features of the brain, which is like where you don't have to learn anything. You're just kind of, extrapolating within your brain. Or alternately, if you have a very rich environment, you might offload more. You might put more things in the environment, ascribe meaning to different objects, and you don't have to invest as much in brain growth. I mean, this is a model for agents, so it's very general. I'm not advocating for any specific species or anything. I'm just saying that this is, as developing agents explore their world, energy can be put into expanding neural tissue or finding ways of encoding information in the environment. And this is maybe through things called affordances, which we talked about in the context of embodiment, where I'm hedging a little bit because this model, and I don't know if I have a picture of it in here, but this model of trade-offs, it involves a bunch of inputs to the organism or to the agent, and then a bunch of outputs. So the agent is taking, there are a lot of factors that are involved in the agent's development. Energetics, information, interactions with other agents. And then the outputs are the brain size, the amount of cognition that's done in the brain versus externalized, and some other factors that you could measure. But the idea, you do have an accounting mechanism where you would look at all the inputs, you would look at the outputs, and you would determine in your agent, and you could do this through simulation, or you could even do this through like a thought experiment. What does that externalization pattern look like? What gets put out in the environment? What gets kept in the brain? So forth. So, there's a certain amount invested in internalization, a certain amount invested in externalization in development. And so we can model this with a mathematical model. So there's this idea of heterochrony, or growth scaling in development. And the idea of heterochrony is that its rate is shifting in time. So heterochrony means different times. And so you can see that, like, if you have a starting point and you have an ending point, if you accelerate or decelerate the rate of that process, you end up with achieving, say, a larger brain volume in a shorter amount of developmental time. Or if you decrease the growth rate, you end up with a smaller brain in a longer amount of developmental time. And so this goes to some of the things we've talked about with respect to critical periods. If you constrain this developmental time for which you can develop this, structure that you're talking about, and you just say you have this window here, well, depending on the rate, you can't grow a big enough brain. I mean, you can grow a big brain if the rate is high, but if the rate is decreased, the brain is smaller, just because you only have a certain amount of developmental time which to develop it. So this is something that we can play around with in agents. We can also look at that parameter K, which is that growth rate, if it's decelerating or accelerating. And we can actually plot it against offloading potential. These are all theoretical graphs, so I'm just giving a sense of the sort of relationships that exist, or predicted relationships. So then K versus offloading potential, this is just the amount of potential we expect for offloading. So as this K decreases, offloading potential so decreases. So as this growth rate gets slower, we expect maybe less offloading potential. I can't remember why that is, but and then there's a sequence heterochrony, which is where you have not a growth rate, but you have these different chunks of development, and sometimes they proceed in place. So sometimes A through E are like a sequence of acquisition events where you're acquiring things in pieces of information, or maybe brain structures that come, that emerge at certain times. And so those are put together in a sequence that is sort of an increasing function. So, you might have like build from one brain structure to 5, and those that go online, and then you end up with your full complement of capacity for the adult agent. Or you could acquire pieces of information to learn how to throw a ball. And it might be 5 different things you need to learn. And you put those in order, and then you have that full capacity. But you can do things like change the order that these occur in development. So you could actually change the order of these different pieces of information or these brain structures and how they emerge, so that you can actually, the capacity goes up and down over development. And this may have an effect on how things are acquired, how things are put together in the adult. And then finally, if we put this together, we have the parameter K, offloading potential, and acquisition. So sometimes people make these kind of graphs where the y-axis has 2 labels. It's like K is like one scale, acquisition is another scale, so that's why it looks like this. But K would have a certain value, and then acquisition would have another value. It's scaled to one another. So, but this is a theoretical graph, so there's no scale here. It's just saying that as K increases, acquisition also increases, and offloading potential increases over time. So this is looking at offloading potential over time. So, I mean, this is like stuff we need to work out in a preprint. We haven't done this yet. This is the next step in working out like the theory and how to apply it. So theory building here, would be like just making up these graphs where you're saying this is the set of relationships we expect. These aren't like, they have no numbers to them right now. They don't really, I can't really draw from an example. I could draw from an example, but this is just an expected sort of set of relationships. So this is why I did this exercise with going through these graphs. It's just kind of like, this is what we expect from these different mechanisms, and this is what's going to result in. So we can actually go then try to find an experimental test bed for this. And we've come up with this interesting one on celestial navigation. So this was something that piqued some interest in the talk. So this is where you have agents down here. And the agents are embodied. They have bodies. They actually have these, they come from eggs. And then they develop into these mature vehicles. And then the idea is that as they hatch and do all this, they're exploring their environment. Their environment is this landscape with trees, but then also with a sky that has stars that move around. So, our nighttime sky, the Earth is rotating and it's going around its orbit. And the stars out in outer space, you can see them at different positions in the sky. So the stars are quote unquote moving, but they're actually, just kind of like moving relative to the observer. So what people have done in different cultures is use stars in the nighttime sky as markers in the environment. So sometimes you have like the North Star, which is where there's a star, always pointing towards the north. And people use that for navigation, or the Southern Cross in the Southern Hemisphere. So you can use these stars to, measure different things. And people have done this in different cultures. And the idea is our agents are going to do this throughout development. They're going to use these landmarks. And maybe they're going to do the computation within their brains, or maybe they're going to use the nighttime sky to sort of build a map and then do computations on that in their brains. So they just basically look at the sky, they figure out the relationships, they do a simple computation, or maybe alternatively, they develop an entire representation of the sky and use that to operate in their brain, so that maybe during the day they can do the same sort of navigation tasks when this sky is blue or white, or overcast, and there are no cues available. So this is I think this isn't something we've developed for agents, but this is something that we would be proposing that could be done. It's a nice, very complex experimental setting. It's a naturalistic, what they call naturalistic experimental setting. And so that's what we would propose. And then we have some references here on different, cognitive offloading and some of the things that we're interested in. There have been a couple papers on this topic where people have looked at developmental offloading in humans. So in human babies, we start off with sort of our own autonomous representation, or not even representations. They're kind of like naive theories of the world. And then as babies mature, they start to, interact with their environment, and then they start to use their objects in the environment in ways that manipulate things or convey information. So as they develop these, semantic abilities, they can link the semantic abilities with some of the things in the environment and use those as markers for things, for cognition. There was another study also in robotic agents, where they did this sort of evolutionary approach, where they used, basically they had the agent had some cognition, and then it offloaded things. And then as it offloaded things and interacted with its environment, it bootstrapped further cognitive development. So cognition was more prevalent after this training period with these offloaded objects. So that's all I want to say about that. And it was a long bit on it. I wanted to go over that because I think it's very interesting, maybe from a cognitive standpoint. Okay, so Jesse asked a couple questions here. Interesting to consider in the context of analog versus digital. Yeah. Baby Bratenberg vehicles. Go ahead.
That the second comment is not a serious comment, but I couldn't resist. But the first one, I think it's really interesting to consider Yeah. Uh, yeah. Sure. Let's go to Amanda's comment about. Can you say more about? I guess that's digital versus analog. My first thought is that it doesn't get more analog than using the environment to store information, since the encoding representation is minimal and thus highly isomorphic. Yeah, that's one of the ones I was gonna try to open up some discussion, because I feel like that's I think there's something, even my third comment, which is also kind of serious, like I think there's something like that's, I'd be really curious to look at, you know, in a developmental sense or evolutionary sense, how that comes about, like the sort of comfort with manipulating or interpreting something in the environment. Um, yeah. So, did you want to say more with that, Amanda?
Not really. That was literally like my first thought, so I don't even know if it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, I like this comment, this Amanda's comment, because it kind of, last part here, that if, the encoding representation is minimal and is highly isomorphic. So there's this area of radical embodied cognition, and I think this came up at the, in one of the, I think our session or Jesse's session, where, it's like you have this idea that in radical embodiment that there's no representation in the brain, that everything is about the environment. So Gibson, who did a lot of ecological psychology, proposed that we take information, direct perception, and use that to shape our cognition in our world. And so that's pretty analog, although you can make that digital. And then you have people who are radical embodiment people who think, well, there's no real representation in the brain. We kind of just do things that are, that's why they call it radical, because usually there would be like a happy medium idea where, well, maybe there's some representations in the brain, and okay. But they don't think that there are really any representations in the brain, which is debatable. And what cognitive offloading, or looking at cognitive offloading in this way, allows you to do is to say that, you're developing representations as you age. So babies really aren't born with representations. They are also not born with stimulation from the environment. They have to be born with something to, just start interacting. And what we find is that they have these sort of innate, naive theories about things. So there's a naive theory of physics that babies engage in when they play with things. They let things drop, or they kick things across the floor, and they want to see how they behave. And then using that, then they can start to bootstrap some of their cognition and some of the representations about the world. And then they start interacting with things out in the environment, and then that bootstraps more. And then you end up with adults that can add thousands of numbers with a calculator. So it goes up to that level. They're interacting with their semantic world, with their physical environment, and then they're building these representations. And then I guess they're isomorphic in the sense that the minimal representations are isomorphic in the sense that they map to the world. So it's like a baby, if they drop a block, they see that it falls, they have to kind of just assume that that's why it is. Whereas, a more, a more adult baby will kind of wonder why that is and have like a theory of why that happens. So it's like you're always building things in development. It could be like morphology, it could be, ideas, it could be information processing. So yeah, I think I like that comment.
Yeah, and I don't know where this is from. I cannot name my reference here, and I wish I could because I want to go deeper into it. But I don't know if it was Paul Kysek related or not. But there was something about how, like, in mammalian development, evolutionary, like going back even to like the time of the dinosaurs and earlier stages, like there was something about certain. I don't really know if it's fair to say it was cognitive offloading, but it was sort of like the ability to communicate around like either interpreting environments in the context of escaping larger predators, like how to navigate an environment to be either to consider an alternate path or to be evasive, and like when you're hiding, like imagine like a squirrel hiding around a tree, like if there's sort of this, you know, sort of set of things that are happening in an evasive sense or like a predictive sense about where someone will go and what they can see. And there was I don't know how to I wish I could find the source material and say here's what I wanted to ask about cognitive offloading and development and communication. But kind of going back to my third comment is like I think that's a really fascinating thing to do, and I think it's also like even to like zoom all the way out and look at like current talks about artificial intelligence. I think it's hard because when we look at current artificial intelligence things that are very strong about certain computations, and it tends to be very brittle in what it can compute. I think it's I think, and I really like one of the things I did like about the Carmel loop. I like how I don't know if it's Josh Bongard, but other people have said the similar things, especially in that environment where it's like, you know, you have to understand evolution has like, you know, several billions of years of development ahead of us in these areas, and it's like and it's like I think it's really convenient to be a prisoner of the moment, as the saying goes, in the sense of looking at for millions and millions and millions of years, you know, these kind of things mandatorily had to happen together to survive. There was no, hey, we really like to take a million years or so and iron out this issue about, you know, how do we want our thumbs to look? Let's just focus on that with nothing else and just spend a million years or so focusing on that problem. That's impossible to happen. There might have been like some niches that were only creating a stimuli that created very specific refinements, or would require that. So that's maybe a different way to say that. But in the broader sense, like I think we have a bit of a, you know, just like there's sort of like a redshift, blue shift in planets, and what we see in the stars is a kind of you know, the stars that we see right now aren't really real. We're seeing these sort of like projected images over that just happen to be hitting our faces at this exact moment. Like what, you know, the stars don't get together and say, hey, we're going to align this way. It's just a bunch of different things happening at the same time that happen to appear in this like snapshot. And I feel like that's a really important way to look at our intelligence right now. And I feel like understanding how cognitive offloading, navigation, embodiment contributed to these things is a really, I think it's really fascinating. And to kind of ground it a bit more again back in things that we've been talking about, or the conference, I really liked when people kind of waxed a bit more poetically or philosophically or however about that kind of stuff at the conference. I think that was very good, and you know, one of the other kind of related highlights, and I was going to mention this. I mentioned this in my talk, and I'll just say it now too. Like, I really liked how Josh Bongard was saying, like, you know, traditionally in robotics there hasn't been a lot of focus on the inner world. It's been mostly how do we explore an external environment, and he basically said something along the lines of, right now we're getting to a place where we can have a robot that's exploring a much more rich and nuanced inner world or inner environment too. And I feel like that's kind of a lot of the interesting stuff that Bradley's getting at, and then also what I was trying to get at in my talk about these dichotomies of how do we talk about this inner world or inner environment exploration in concert with the external environment. And I feel like that's getting way more towards what evolution has been having to deal with forever. It was never an option. It was never evolutionary. Hey, let's just not focus on this thing. It was like, no, it's how do you have this system that can stay alive and have this chain of life for billions of years and make these like incremental adjustments. And so anyway, that's my soapbox about that. Okay. Um,
Okay.
Erin said something like, and some of the arrivals we have had, the way humans have evolved could have occurred in myriad ways. Yeah. Um, there's I think this was so fascinating also about like comparative uh, takes on intelligence. Like we look at like octopus and other like dolphins, and that would be the one of the most fascinating things in this area would be like to find extraterrestrial intelligent life and compare notes. But until then, uh, you know, that's actually also related to kind of throw it back to the developmental concept of like what we talked about in CogSci 2021 with the Arenti paper about the role of development in psychology and cognitive science. Like, how can we study some of this stuff now? And like it kind of has turned to both developmental robotics as an embodiment we can use that's fairly ethically okay as opposed to doing things on young humans or whatever else. Um, and I'm curious, like I think the next frontier also, and who I found out, I feel a little bit, I feel like I should have known this before, but using virtual reality too, maybe another methodology for this specifically. And I got to do it, but I found out Tony Shamiro of Radically Embodied Cognition Person was like, I was asking on Twitter, like, hey, I'm using VR to do this stuff in cognitive science. Like, oh yeah, we have a whole, like, all of our work in this area at this university kind of uses VR. So I'll be looking at that soon. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
I'm taking notes everywhere.
Yeah, it's very, very rich conversation today. So yeah, I don't know if maybe we want to move on. If you have questions, please we put them in the Slack and let's continue with this conversation. I think it's useful and interesting. And I know a lot of you probably don't have, maybe have never heard of embodied cognition before. So there's a lot of background reading that you may need to do, but just kind of listen to this conversation, just catch some of the keywords and then look up the keywords. And definitely if you have questions about like what is I don't know, offloading, we can like tie that to a set of readings. So like there's a literature on a lot of these terms. So the terms are there because people are defining them in a literature with citations, and people have like defined terms there. So it's like, this is how you build knowledge about an area. Like you just go to the area, you use the key terms, you look up those key terms, you find some references. And when I talk about annotated bibliography, that's actually what that is. It's basically going through a bunch of terms and saying this area, like intelligence offloading, has this set of readings. Energetics in cognition maybe has this set of readings. And so then you can link those together. And by the end of the day, you have a lot of concepts that you've never heard of, and you have some nice readings, and then you have maybe a description underneath those references that orient you to what each paper is, and you can identify gaps in the field. And I also talked a little bit, I hinted at in presenting that Medium post about theory building. And that's another thing I want to do. We don't really have any good resources for theory building. It's hard to find really good resources online. You end up going into different, field-specific materials, like in management or in education, and so I want to do that in the coming weeks and months. But I just wanted to make people aware that that's a thing that we do, and theory building is a very useful exercise for if you want to say, if you have an idea about something, you want to take it from like this weird idea to something you can test. it's definitely a way to like get that idea. And I don't mean weird like that. It's not useful. It's just kind of like something that I don't know really how to define, or it's a hard to get my head around what I mean by this idea. What its implications are. We can go into we can go through this theory building process where you draw out those graphs and you plot the expected relationships. You take a guess at it. You don't know. You haven't run the experiments, but you can kind of like build some relationships, things that maybe people should be looking at in terms of variables or things to measure. So that's why we might use VR, we might use robotic agents, we might use computational methods of some type or another, and then this is how we figure all this out. This theory building process. So more on that in the future, but for now. I'd like to move on to some other things too. It's already 10:20 or 20 after. So let me go to. So I know Jesse's been working on this blog post for the presentation that he gave in the session, and he mentions in doing this, and I know that Amanda was involved in this heavily. Also Jenny. As well as I was involved a little bit in it and putting together these materials. And I gave him I gave Jesse a graph that I found on Twitter actually that was like where someone pointed out that you have these AI summers and winters. And what accompanies the AI summers or what accompanies the AI winters is this investment in HCI or human computer interaction. So I looked up more about it. What was that?
Do you want me to show the graph or part of the presentation?
Oh, yeah, actually, yeah, I can unshare my screen. You can show the graph if you want. I don't have the graph on me, but why don't you put it up?
Yeah. I'll very quickly mention that.
Yeah. So
can
this
you see
is yeah.
This is actually one of this is the slides from the presentation. That's kind of the final outline from our collaborators. So this is the question I mentioned with Josh Bongard, and I kind of transcribed some of his notes, but he's basically saying how the inner life, and they said, but basically it'll be really interesting when we can really study well things happening within and without the agent at the same time and having real functions of what that looks like. And that will kind of take some things to the next level. So I really like that quote for it. Let me see I don't know where that thing is. This is background and history stuff. This is where some of Bates' conversation from Jenny's stuff here, his kind of analysis and his talking about this insight as this encounter between mind and environment. I mentioned Sutton papers, which we talked about, and I think here we go. This was the graph, and also just to kind of just to quickly I'll take a really quick tour of this. We'll go back to this, but I talked about this. We talked about analog and digital. This is Amanda's slide. We talked about that, and I referenced that in terms of kind of our discussion on the EGRT and mapping from last time. Mentioned discussion group. This is the paper I just mentioned from Arente. Some of the allostatic kinds work with Avery. Whoops, I think I just hit the wrong button. Sorry. Oops, I'm all over the place. I hit the wrong button. Okay. And then kind of what we're working on in terms of the terminology, major dichotomies and paradigms, some of our models, frontier maps, peripersonal space that you want to look into, and then the VR stuff, which is our other submission. That was kind of that project really quickly. But the presentation really quickly. The graph here was this one, and I can make this a little bit bigger for the time being. But it was in the context of talking about okay, we have this historical lens, we have Sutton's quest for the common model, which is kind of very deep learning heavy perhaps, and then the critique of deep learning with Marcus and this, and then also just understanding that there's this this trajectory that goes back and forth over time. And I think Bradley's talking about the HCI, when there wasn't a big focus on AI, whatever it was at the time, strong AI funding and optimism, there was a dip, and it kind of coincided with this focus on human-computer interaction. Is that what you're gonna get towards?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a very good way to set this up. So you can see these dips, AI winters and downturns. You have these expansions of human-computer interaction. So yes, thank you, Jesse, for that. And that was his. It was our talk on that topic. So this is Jonathan Gruden, and he works at Microsoft Research, and he's a very high-profile HCI researcher, and he did this history of HCI and AI. So two fields divided by a common focus. And I did a little bit of research on this for a blog post, and I found that this article where he talks about how HCI, or human computer interaction, is really something that developed alongside of AI. So AI was being funded by the military. They wanted to know, how we could build supercomputers that would do, code breaking. Alan Turing did a lot of groundbreaking work on that in England during World War II, and then that continued on where we were trying to do all these different computations for for the military and then for corporations. So there's this history of AI being sort of useful in that way, and that's where it originates. Now HCI originated actually in the same time period. So it originated in World War II, and this is a time when they started building large air forces and naval ships. And like when you were operating these things, you had these huge control panels where you had a bunch of buttons. And the idea was that you didn't know which button to press. If you pressed the wrong button, it could be disastrous. So you really want to know how to design those layouts so that people wouldn't make mistakes. You also wanted to make sure that people could be trained. Flight training was an important part of early HCI. It doesn't seem like computers, but it's the same idea of interfaces. And so this is where it comes from. And so the way that Gruden poses this distinction between AI summers and HCI summers, as it were, is that there was a shift in attention. So people were paying attention to AI at certain times, and there were advances being made. And when AI was kind of in its periods of disrepute, in those AI winters, people started focusing on HCI. So you started to get computer screens in the 1960s, and you started getting people like H.C. Licklider, who developed some of the first work on some of the first interfaces. You also had Alan Kay work on the first mouse, and that was, I think, a little bit later on. So there were, luminaries like that. They worked in some of the corporate labs at some of the tech companies, IBM and later Apple, and those were the big labs. Some of the national labs, I think, may have been involved as well. So it's basically the same sort of area. You had computers being run. They're running these big programs, and then as they started to have interfaces, and even before that with machines that were being operated by humans, you had to have that sort of, people became very interested in how humans were interacting with those machines. So he breaks it down in, the overview of forces that kept AI and HCI apart. So these were rival areas. They weren't the same area. If you go to a computer science department today, you have HCI research, AI research, other types of research. They were very far apart early on. They were not part of the same conversation at all. And so, this is something that maybe affects how we paid attention to one and then the other. I don't know. In the 1950s, AI origins in the beginning of a roller coaster ride. So this kind of goes through some of the things that, Alan Turing was doing with code breaking, and then people were kind of thinking about how, maybe we use computers, but really they were thinking about the, AI aspect of it. Like Isaac Asimov or iRobot, which was a book about the 3 laws of robotics, that didn't really have any HCI in it because people weren't thinking about that at the time. And then, John McCarthy was an early AI person. They had a workshop in the 50s on this, and there really wasn't a lot of thought about usability as we know it today. But then in the early 60s, there was a lull in AI. And this is when HCI kind of broke through. So part of the pattern is that HCI thrived on resources that were freed when interest in AI declined. So as we stopped funding AI for a little bit, we started to put those resources into HCI. So the MIT Lincoln Lab, they looked for new uses for their massive computers. And so this is when, sort of human factors in HCI, or what was the precursor to HCI, I guess, was what they call human factors research. That sort of transitioned into looking at computers instead of displays. And so then you have this new opportunity for a field. Grace Hopper, Brian Shackle, these were early people in HCI work. So Grace Hopper in particular is an important figure in this area. And so these are early, these are people who started to kind of look at how we could use computers instead of just plugging numbers into them, how we could actually interact with them. And so there was this early invention of a sketchpad, which is, these are some of the early sort of what I'm doing right now. It wouldn't be possible without some of this early work where they're looking at how do you use a mouse or a sketchpad, or, how do you put things into the computer as a human. And so that's what they were interested there. Then in the mid-60s through mid-70s, we pushed our focus back to AI, and that doesn't mean that HCI died. It means that we weren't paying as much attention. So in 1960, Licklider published an influential essay entitled Man-Computer Symbiosis. So this is where he applied the idea of symbiosis to people and computers. So there's a fundamental relationship there that's established. And importantly, Licklider became the director of ARPA's Information Processing Office. So ARPA was the precursor to DARPA, which is the arm of the military that funds a lot of high stakes, maybe risky research that we use a lot today. So HCI was really kind of working in the shadows of AI, but it was really kind of making its own strides. Then eventually, you had people like Nicholas Negroponte at MIT where, we needed to understand speech. So now we had speech recognition as part of bringing HCI and AI a little bit closer together. And then, you had people later on, you had this HCI was becoming more a part of computer science. And so, you had things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was, maybe AI promised a way out of crises like that, but HCI also had a role in that. You might have a situation like, I don't know if you've seen the movie War Games, where they had and this was based on a real set of events, where the computers told people that there was an imminent attack by the enemy. And so, the consequences of responding to that threat would have been catastrophic, but people realized just by thinking independently that wasn't the case. So this is something, of course, where you're using an AI to tell you to make a decision, and if you had made that decision, it would have been the wrong decision. And so, focusing on things like screen layout and other types of checks, command names, text editors, and things like that, both, big and small HCI things, applying it to that problem that we see in war games, would clearly mitigate your problem. And so HCI actually had some of the first, if we think about AI ethics, that's some of the first AI ethics. It really kind of forced us to think beyond I'm just going to do what the machine tells me. It gave us these set of tools to sort of mediate between what the machine was telling us in our decision making. So this is something that I think, is a really interesting kind of point here. Then there are two conceptions of human intelligence. So, there were some people who believed in early AI that artificial intelligence was on the verge of rivaling human intelligence. But, do you want to look to psychology for that, or do you want to go on your own? And so, McCarthy, who was one of the early AI people, he wrote that, as suggested by the term artificial intelligence, we weren't considering human behavior except as a clue to possible effective ways of doing tasks. The only participants who studied human behavior were Newell and Simon, who are also early AI researchers, and they have written a lot of interesting stuff on sort of cybernetics oriented stuff as well. So there is that early work. But the goal was to get away from studying human behavior and consider the computer as a tool for solving certain classes of problems. Thus, AI was created as a branch of computer science and not as a branch of psychology. So it's interesting. AI and HCI were both they're both sort of part of cognitive science. In the cognitive science program I was in, we had HCI people, we had AI people. There has always been this tension between like psychology and computer science. Where do these things belong? And AI was much more sort of oriented towards computer science, whereas HCI was towards computer science, but also towards psychology. Sometimes you go to psychology departments, you find HCI people. A lot more often they're in cognitive science groups, and you also find them in computer science. So, but the idea here, I think, is that HCI drew much more fundamentally from psychology, as you might expect, but that psychologists were doing some of this work. Licklider was a psychologist, and there were other people who were doing this work who were psychologists. So they had that psychological viewpoint, and they brought it into computing. Whereas in AI, they were kind of thinking from the standpoint of logic and mathematics, and then applying that to computers. Computer science as a discipline actually formed in about the 40s and 50s, and it was like a combination. It was almost like the first cognitive science, because it had psychologists and linguists and mathematicians, philosophers, and they said, okay, how do we build this discipline of the computer? And so things got tossed in and things got tossed out early on. So the development of these two areas sort of it exists in this larger backdrop of computer science developing as a discipline of its own, and then later cognitive science developing. And so I know Jesse's a really big fan of this paper, Whatever Happened to Cognitive Science. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't remember that history as well. So, HCI has been developing as AI was really kind of moving. And here's this figure. This is actually, I think the origins of this figure was this paper by Gruden. So now we know where this comes from. This is the figure that Jesse showed. So I just took it as something I found on Twitter. Someone else did it, but I think this is the origin. So, and then again, we have an AI winter in the mid 70s, early 80s, AI winter, springtime for HCI. AI rides high again in the 80s, and then HCI during the AI summer is when, actually not when HCI died or withered, but that they were actually making strides. It's just people weren't paying as much attention to them. So SIGCHI formed in 1982. That's the professional organization. And then, you had fewer computer scientists involved in HCI during this time of an AI summer, but they were still making progress. The graphical user interface was kind of coming to maturity, and people were really interested in working with the issues related to that. So, there is this nice deep history of HCI, and it really does relate to both AI and to computer science and to cognitive science in its development. So I could go on all day about that probably, but I won't, because I want to get to some comments in the chat here. So yeah, this is okay. So Jesse said, another discussion: AI in military and technologies used in supporting warlike or divisive technologies. Yeah, a lot of these areas come out of World War II, and World War II, I guess it was thought of as almost like the public good, like what Turing was doing. Was defending the country of England from the Nazis, and so that was thought of as a good. But of course, we think of the military as not so good, and which is true, but it's like that context matters when you are in history, and it's coming out of the military, so it's coming out of military funding, and they expect you to do things that they're interested in. And so if you're interested in something like usability, it's not going to come from military funding. It's maybe going to come from some other funding. You were going to show something, Jesse?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Erin.
Basically, I'm sorry to scare you. All right, hold on. Basically, I wanted to mention Ramon Amaro because a lot of his work, and I don't know, I looked at his website during this talk, and I don't know where he is on some of the things he was trying to do. But he, when I don't know really I digitally met him a while ago, and he had some interesting work on this area and looking even at like the development of calculus and a lot of technologies in the past and how a lot of technology over time or innovations in STEM have been at the service of some exploitive elements of culture or like divisive things. So I just wanted to mention that as like I was hoping that he was I think he was writing a book, but I don't think it's done yet because I was trying to see his website here, but I don't see it there. But maybe in the meantime, I'll just mention this Atlas of Anomalous AI looks pretty cool. And for like the ethics team and stuff, I might check out. Whoops, where'd you go? I might look more into this. And I also want to mention Ruha Benjamin and who else was I going to say here? I'm trying to look at my comment here. Yeah, okay, and yeah, I'll reshare my screen in a moment, but I wanted to mention Johan's thread also about cognitive science, but that's kind of a separate topic for later.
Yeah, looks like
so that was that comment, and I think Brian mentioned the Dream Machine.
Yeah. And that was about Licklider and the ARPA. Yeah.
Yeah, and about the development of cognitive science and the history of the internet and AI in general. It's really, I listened to it on tape because I do a lot of driving. And it's about 25 hours long. So when I first saw it, I thought, oh, this is great. This is going to really fill the time. But it ended up being just really a good description of kind of how JCR Licklider was able to, through his positions at at MIT and ARPA, later DARPA, was able to kind of foster this user-focused vision of computers as something that could be exciting and fun for everyone to use, and that also push the boundaries in ways that, as the book explains, can't really happen nowadays because of the way that funding structures are set up. But it's really, it goes so deep in every direction. It's a really good book.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, you should give a presentation at some point if you would like. Sure. And yeah. Yeah, so why don't we get back to that maybe next week. Yeah, human level AI is only 2 decades away. The narrative for the last 80 years. Yeah, that's the thing. Like, it's always around the corner. And there was this debate, of course, between, there was this Twitter dust-up between, what's his name, Gary Marcus and some other people in deep learning about, like, deep learning hitting a wall. And you mentioned that in your talk. And then, the wall being, like, being not saying that you're able to simulate human level cognition, basically, or that it's not like that maybe the results that we're getting aren't as applicable or sort of generalizable as we'd like. So yeah, I mean that's another issue. So yeah, I'm gonna go on here. We're running short on time, I think. So the other thing I wanted to show is the state of AI in 9 charts, and this is from the Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Lab at Stanford. And I found this interesting because it's like there are these 9 charts that kind of go through some of the state of AI. So, one is what are the top skills most requested by employers. And so machine learning, artificial intelligence, neural networks, they separate out, then natural language processing, and then robotics is 5. And these are like, I guess they're from a survey of job ads, what people are looking for, and these are all basically AI related. So, it's interesting how people break them down. They're probably using them for different reasons, but it's something that's in very high demand. And then,
do they differentiate at all, like what they mean by AI from the other things there?
Yeah, they
Like
don't
it's
really
like,
say. I think they're just like keywords, though. It's not like
mm,
they run a resume through a machine, and they have like keywords and they find them and they put you in a pile, and it's like, I don't know. It could be like I study the history of artificial intelligence, or I'm doing like an agent that's more machine learning, but they don't really make that distinction. But the idea, I think, is that there's this high demand for a lot of these different sub areas. And then employment for new AI PhDs. So it's like, you know, actually industry has taken the lead here in terms of employing people. But that's because, you're doing a lot of stuff with startups. Then that's where AI experts tend to work in places like that. There's a small role for government jobs, but mostly it's academia, and increasingly, actually, a majority of jobs are in industry. Then there's this new U.S. resident PhDs, so there's a representation gap in AI, um, and we still have a ways to go with uh, uh, Black and African American people, Hispanic people, Native Americans, and multiracial people becoming involved in the field. So there's an opportunity for diversity, for representation or increasing representation in the field. Um, and it hasn't grown like, with the opportunities perhaps. The private investment in AI, so there's this private investment that's gone way up, of course. And this is, of course, the deep learning revolution from 2013 on. So this has been like, especially in 2021, there's a huge increase in private investment. And I don't know why that is exactly. It may be because we're getting these nice platforms where you have, you can do things with PyTorch and with other tools, with GPT-3 and so forth. But from a business perspective, there's been a lot of private investment, and it's been a huge increase in the last year, which is interesting. And then, thinking about how it's hitting a wall. Now, will this fall off at some point? Maybe. This is the thing about AI summers and winters, that you get this huge amount of investment and then things just kind of fall off a cliff. But I don't know if that's going to be the case heading forward. It's really, this maybe is a sign of a hype cycle, but who knows? And then number of AI publications by field. So this is where you have different fields of what people are doing with AI. Pattern recognition and machine learning dominate. There's some computer vision. There's natural language processing. Human-computer interaction is at about 10% of the publications. So we just talked about that. I think that's interesting that it's being applied there. Control theory, of course, 8.745% of publications in AI that use AI or from that area. So it's largely dominated by statistical learning maybe, and like recognizing patterns and images, I assume, and then computer vision. And then there's some natural language processing, which is like 13%, some data mining. So, these are things that you see all the time, right? These are the sort of the canonical papers that you always see. So there are a lot of opportunities for new avenues here. They're probably, I don't see VR on here, but there are probably opportunities there. Yeah. So, they didn't sample things that were of low frequency. So maybe there are papers in AI and VR, but they aren't really anywhere near like representative of what's going on in the field. Number of AI patent filings, again, that's going way up. And again, this is just people working in the area, securing patents. It's not, it's to be expected when there's a lot of investment in the field. And then a robot for everyone. So, the thing to remember is this is becoming more accessible and affordable. So, in the summers and winters pattern of investment and of interest comes this idea of making this technology diffuse. So, like the early computers, you had just a couple of groups working on the problems, and so that made it much more volatile, because if those few groups weren't making progress, then the funding attention would shift somewhere else. If a lot of people are doing it, there are a lot more opportunities for sort of, where some people are making progress, some people are being, are static. And so that sort of volatility of a summers and winters kind of dampens when everyone has the technology and is using it for different purposes. And then this scholars focus on fairness, accountability, and transparency or fact. And this is, of course, the AI ethics area. So, this is where the people interested in this area are largely from education, from academia, but you see an increasing interest from government and nonprofits, actually, in industry. So there's industry here in the green, and there's nonprofits here, and government is a small slice, but it's, becoming visible here. So this is becoming increasingly diverse with respect to people in different sectors of the economy. So it's definitely interesting to see nonprofits on the list and what their interests are. Then, AI-related bills, of course, that's going up or the number of proposed bills are going up. Number of passed bills actually has remained static. So people are proposing a lot of legislation for regulating AI, but we're not really there in terms of getting things through.
That's actually a really interesting chart. I haven't thought about that. That's really interesting to see that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I think the pattern here is we talk about it, and then we, propose solutions, and then those solutions come, but they come, over time. It doesn't just happen. So, those are a lot of interesting trends going on in AI, and I wanted to go over that. Do we have any questions before we move on, or?
I'll have to look at, like, if you could put that link in the Slack.
Oh yeah, I'll put them in the Slack after.
I might mention Johan's thing, but I don't know if you want to just jump to other papers or whatever.
Well, I'll go to paper if you can do this in like 5 minutes, and then we'll move to papers, and then that'll be the meeting.
Yeah, it won't take too long.
Yeah.
Let's just share this. So, this can you see this? I think so.
Yeah.
This is a it's asking what if this real pure cognitive science exists anymore, and has there been new real cognitive science textbooks published in the last 10-15 years? And the answer is yes, but he this is interesting recording about his base textbook. But I think it's important to think that where's this bubble comment? Yeah, it's important to realize that Johan is someone I respect immensely, but he was kind of aware of his own bubble, or at least considering that he was aware of his own bubble, and realizing that he's deep into neuroscience, and he doesn't quite follow some of the stuff, so he's kind of asking about this. So I think it's a nice thing to demonstrate that. And there's a reference to this book. There's a reference to what's going on with this. And I actually did really briefly. I don't know what to say about it yet, but this is I might be looking more at this book, which is maybe perhaps a more recent take on things. Were you going to say something, Bradley?
Oh yeah, I downloaded that book. I found it interesting.
Oh yeah, recently or from this?
Oh no, from this thread. I think I downloaded it as a consequence of that. But
that's cool. Yeah, it's just anyone can see it. But yeah, that's it. Just an interesting thread about there is a lot of work here, but it's also it's in Toronto this year. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. We can move on to other things.
All right. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, Jesse. Do we have any comments on that? I guess there's always this tension in CogSci between like becoming like neuroscience or just having like, because I mean CogSci, of course I told you that like there are all these different areas, subfields, like there's linguistics, and then there's logic, and there's like HCI, which is human computer interaction, and a lot of those don't rely on, and there's of course some cultural work. A lot of those don't necessarily rely on like an account of the brain, like directly. You think about the brain and you say, okay, it's obviously involved. We're not really interested in measuring the brain, so it's just kind of there, and we're interested in what the brain is doing, which is fine. And people build cognitive models that are not so much models of the brain in terms of brain regions or activity, but it's like what the brain is doing. So they're boxes and arrows that go, to like attention or different mechanisms that are proposed, different information processing that goes on. And there's an area of basal cognition, which of course is something Michael Levin does, which is where they're proposing that cognition is information processing, but you can actually decouple it from a nervous system and say, look at an organism, it doesn't have a brain, or has a very rudimentary brain, but still has cognition. So like, you could see this in cells, for example, where they don't have a brain, they have a network of, information processing, but you can use cognition or basal cognition to explain that. So there's that aspect to it, but also people do things with like decision making. So they make these charts where they show decision making as a set of steps or processes.
When you say basal cognition, cognition, what is that?
So it's just another term. Like sometimes they'll call it aneural cognition or non-neuronal cognition. What they mean by basal is that it's at the base of the phylogenetic tree of life, or closer to the base than like specific organisms. So like basal means like ancestral. So that's the idea, and it's like the fundamental core of cognition. If you didn't have a brain, if you had like the first or instance of cognition in life would be basal cognition, because it's at the basal part of the phylogenetic tree, or where the root is. That's what they mean by that. I don't necessarily like the term, because when they use it, they always use it in the modern context. Like, here's what cells do, and these are evolved information processing pathways. So it's not like we have this good account of what early life was doing cognitively, if they were doing anything cognitively. So
yeah, some interesting, like I don't remember if I think this was before the intern showed up, but there was I think it was a podcast discussion with Michael Levin, and it was kind of talking about when we're getting to some allostatic kinds discussion with Avery. I was mentioning Levin's work on basal cognition in the real sense of looking specifically evolutionary way back when there wasn't really brains and the sort of electrical patterning going on, and even like in pre-neuronal states, like what were the precursors to neurons? What did those like circuitries look like, and how did that come about, and all that stuff? And were there any? One of the things that I never really forged the connection, but wanted to, in terms of stuff Avery is interested in, is like I think someone in the podcast mentioned like, oh, what about like Jungian archetypes or other like personality theory stuff? It's more specific, like, were there any? And this is really interesting to think also in terms of like the digital analog divide again. Well, like, were there any physical or perhaps analog developments in the at a basal cognition pre-neuronal or like proto-neuronal perhaps arena that like shaped had significant downstream influence over time, and I don't think I don't like in the podcast Levin was like, oh, that's a possibility. It was like, oh yeah, definitely we can do that, and obviously then it'd be kind of a impossible to study feature, but it's an interesting thing to think about and consider, or maybe even try to, if we could ever get to a place where we kind of like when we talk about developmental studying in robotics or psychology or whatever, it's tough because there's development in a single agent sense, and there's also like, there's genetic algorithms like that, but development over the like preceding structure, like I don't how would you how I don't like I don't know, maybe there's more to this than I realize, but like yeah, and then I'll try. I don't know the name of it, but I have it somewhere in my notes. It wasn't one that I normally watch, but
Yeah, I think there's a link between development and evolution that we have to spell out here. I mean, because people have done this, but it's yeah, we have to really kind of spell it out a little bit more, and I think that would be a good opportunity to maybe put that out there, maybe at a conference or something where we kind of go over development, evolution, and then what does it mean for cognition? Because I don't think that's very clear in a lot of people's minds. People will conflate a lot of things, and so it would be useful to do that.
yeah. And I was gonna say, like, anything that, like, what I was talking about right now is like, I don't even know. I don't know if there are efforts to model things like that and developmentally and evolutionary in the sense of like going. Like I don't know if this is kind of related to the brain organoid stuff, but uh, like, could you even? Is there any tenable way to model like, okay, here's a proto blank, whatever, it's like a proto neuron or proto whatever, and then like these physical constraints, and then like evolution beyond that. Like I don't think that's. I think that's. I haven't I haven't looked at it, but I don't know if like you've heard of anything that like is that's like super evolutionary inception level stuff, and that might be impossible to do. But
Well, there are experimental models where they look at like different things. Like they have things called protocells, which are like just little bags of proteins that they do experiments on. And in the A-Life literature, there's some work on that. Then there are like stem cells and precursor cells, and like organoids are basically a model where we can take like an organ outside the context of the human body and look at its development. So you can look at the complexity that emerges, and it's not a real organ. But like you might be able to build a heart or a brain as like from a single cell or small population of cells that are of stem cells that differentiate and become this organ, and then measure what it's doing in that sort of emergent development. So there's this emergent aspect of it. But those are all models. They're just like a computational model or a box and arrows model. They have limited utility in terms of telling us certain things. Like development is very different from that. Evolution, of course, is very different, and so it's hard to really get those. Again, we need to deconflate those things. I think that's very useful. But yeah, there are ways to do this. There are ways to at least peek into that window. And so yeah, that's something we can talk about another time if people are interested.
okay, sounds good.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go over our one paper, and then if you have to leave, it's fine. But it'll take like 10 minutes to do this. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for posting that thing in the chat. So let me go to the Fermat's library. So I'm trying to figure out what we want to do here. What do we talk about this paper? Cultural evolutionary theory. This is I think this is going to be a pretty long paper. I'm just going to try to summarize it. So we've talked about cultural evolution in the group before, and there's a deadline coming up this next month on the Cultural Evolution Society in a conference, and so we'll be talking more about what we want to submit for that. I have some ideas which I'll talk about coming up. So this is Marcus Feldman, who's a famous person. He wrote some of the first stuff on cultural evolution and how to link that to population genetics. And Nicole Crianza is at Vanderbilt and does a lot of stuff in this area. So this is cultural evolutionary theory. So human cultural traits, which are defined as behaviors ideas and technologies that can be learned from other individuals. So cultural traits are learned. And, cultural traits can also be modeled as an evolutionary process. So this is something that is, sometimes conflated, but if we work on the proper sort of theoretical framework for this, we can see the differences between, say, like biological evolution and cultural evolution and learning in individual organisms. And then and social learning, which happens across individuals and across generations. So these are all things that, need to be kind of clarified. So human cultural traits can exhibit complex patterns of transmission and evolution. So transmission is where you're passing on a trait from one person to another. It could be in a classroom like I'm doing right now, or it could be in a familial context where parent is passing on to child. In evolution, of course, they're constrained by generational transmission. So a genetic trait is passed on from an adult or a parent to the child, and then there isn't any passing on from child to child. We don't have horizontal gene transfer, but in culture you could have that. Certainly have like passing on to peers or other non-familial members. So this is something that we have to account for in our theoretical models. So there have been a number of verbal and mathematical theoretical models to sort of understand these patterns. They're very complex, mainly because people conflate them with different things, but also because you have to have a good definition of culture, which is not necessarily something that we have. Anthropologists have a theory of culture, and then psychologists kind of have their own. And there are other areas where culture is defined, like in memetics or in other areas, and it's just it depends on what you want to use. I like the anthropological definitions because that's what I grew up on, but you could pick your own, I guess. So many of the first quantitative models of cultural evolution, which I think Marcus Feldman, he wrote a book in 1981 on this, and it's very similar to sort of a population genetics treatment of it. But that doesn't mean that that's the only way that culture evolves. There are different mathematical models that could be used. Many of the first models were modified from existing concepts in theoretical population genetics because cultural evolution has many parallels with this area, but it also has clear differences. And so some of these transmission dynamics are where the differences lie. You have, for example, transmission from parent to child, but also peer to peer. And so, and since these models have, like these first models of cultural evolution have evolved, I might add, there have been a lot of models in computer science where people have looked at things like peer-to-peer sharing or like information dissemination online. And then there's a whole field of diffusion of innovations, which was a famous paper by Rogers that kind of happened in parallel with this or earlier, where they talked about how ideas spread in a population. They were talking about cultural evolution, but they didn't call it that. So, there are a lot of competing models. Some of these are quantitative, some of these are qualitative. These first models of cultural evolution itself were modified population genetics models. And then there are other classes of models that kind of incorporate some of these network effects and parallel transfer of information. So this is getting pretty messy. So at this point, we need to think about like what we want to know about culture. Is it about like, pop culture or the spread of ideas, or is it maybe something more like a cultural trait that you would have in like a culture, like in a ethnic population where they've lived in a certain region for thousands of years and they have like, certain adaptations to the environment? Well, if our interest is the latter, then we can have these models where we have gene culture coevolution and dual inheritance. So these are models that kind of draw from like the relationship between culture and genes. So if you have human populations that are evolving over thousands of years, ethnic populations that maybe evolved in the far north, or ethnic populations that evolved in a, like without the ability to digest lactose, these sorts of things. These are things that we call gene cultural coevolution. So, cultural traits have emerged because your genes allow you to do certain things or don't allow you to do certain things. People will develop cultural practices around some of these things, or, maybe eating certain things or whatever. And so this is an important aspect of cultural evolution, where you have this relationship between some genetic substrate and the cultural evolution. So given that they co-evolve and there's this dual inheritance of culture and genes, they can also evolve in different directions. So sometimes, culture evolves in ways that augment people's ability to live in a certain region. So for example, you might have, in some cases where you have, you live in an extreme environment like a desert or in the Arctic, you might have cultural traits that allow you to survive in that region. Special tools, special housing, the knowledge to live there. But you also have genes that are adapted to those regions. Now, genetic evolution is slower than cultural evolution. So sometimes culture allows you to stay in a place, to live there while your genes catch up. Sometimes, they evolve in the same direction because, you're living in a place that's extreme. You need these adaptations to survive. And so, there you go. But sometimes culture can evolve independently of genes. So, you might have a cultural practice of drinking milk, whereas you may not have an allele that allows you to digest milk. So, there's this mismatch sometimes of culture and genetic evolution. And this happens, because humans are always moving around the world, and culture is dynamic, much more dynamic than genetic evolution. So their interest is mainly in, in this sort of long-term cultural evolution and the tie-ins to genetics. Now, it's interesting that when we talk about agents, and, agents are not like humans and not, other organisms of culture, not just humans. But agents could also model this sort of relationship, especially when we talk about like a sort of a innate layer for agents. And, they may have genetic evolution. If you have a genetic algorithm, for example, you can run a genetic algorithm and there's an output in the agent. What's interesting is you could also have a cultural layer on top of that, where agents are interacting and they're forming their own cultures. And then you have this issue of gene culture coevolution, but in agents. And this is something I'm going to talk about maybe in the next coming weeks, about this sort of relationship. So this is why I wanted to go over this paper today, because it kind of gives you kind of a taste of where this type of work is going, and it's something that we don't talk about as much in CogSci. So you're going to say something,
Is
Jesse?
that like thinking about like metabrains plus culture layer?
Yeah, well, I mean, in a metabrain, it would be that there would be like a genetic encoding at the bottom, and then you'd have like layers of representation. So you might have like a basic network for like a brain, just kind of pattern recognition, and then another layer which would be like a cultural layer. How, when you interact with your fellow agents, what kinds of ideas are they passing? They may pass some part of a representation to you, for example. And that representation might be cultural. So it's like, you're developing this way of life in that environment. And then the genetics are telling you maybe you can exploit certain resources or not. But then the cultural layer is maybe telling you how to interact with those things. There are different ways you can implement it, but that would be the idea, I think. One of the key things I wanted to focus on was this idea of a dual inheritance model. And so this is where you have a cultural aspect and a genetic aspect. And the genetic aspect confers fitness. So the genetic part of the model, might have like the organism might have a fitness that's assessed just basically by, are its genes fit? And this is kind of hard to measure because the cultural layer then has its own fitness. But sometimes the cultural layer can overcome some of the deficits of the genetic inheritance. So if you, for example, your genotype, if you didn't have culture, your genotype was just interacting with the environment, and you weren't, you didn't have a very high fitness because your genotype was, not aligned with sort of the selection of the environment. The cultural model might supplant that and might actually give you a fitness advantage. So I know that's a lot of thinking to go through, but basically, the cultural aspect of like a dual inheritance model can overcome some of the deficits of selection. So it affects selection in different ways. So in this paper, they review the core concepts of cultural evolutionary theory, which I won't get into, but I'll put this in the Slack so you can read it more if you're interested. Um, as they pertain to the extension of biology through culture. So biology, it's extended into culture. Culture allows individuals or agents to overcome their sort of the fitness constraints of their genome, allows individuals to live in extreme environments or do things that they couldn't do just with their own, suite of genetic traits. Then there's this idea of focusing on cultural evolutionary applications in population genetics, ecology, and demography. So this is the study of populations, and so there are a lot of issues there, and that's not has nothing to do with agents necessarily, but there are a lot of things in anthropology and in biology and other areas where these topics are important. So for each of these disciplines, we review the theoretical literature and highlight relevant empirical studies and discuss the societal implications of the study of cultural evolution. So they kind of go through all these different things. It's a nice review. This just kind of shows human culture and human genes, a difference between transmission dynamics. You have these all these factors that go into, you have culture, you have genetics, you have demography, you have niche construction, which is another idea that we won't talk about today, but this is where you create an environment using culture that affects then your genetic evolution. So there are feedbacks that are indirect. And so, yeah, we can talk about this more, but I'm going to try to go in this direction a little bit with this Cultural Evolution Society submission. And we'll talk about this in the coming weeks. Okay, so are there any questions before we... I know I went quite a ways over my allotted time. Probably about right.
I'm going to report you to the director of science at orthogonal lab for going so far.
Yeah, it's going to be a recursive report. Yeah.
No, it's good. I actually want to read that paper. I'm so it's been tough for me because I'm trying to organize my life so I have a dedicated period of time more often specifically for reading and also for writing. I'm considering maybe it'd be fun to use like Fermat's library as a augmentation of that, or maybe like making an oral, something for the lab there. I don't know. That's not really a major thing, but I definitely want to go through that paper, and I'm curious. Do you think next week we'll be talking more about the Cultural Evolution Society stuff, or
yeah, I
don't
hope
know
to have
when
something
that's...
written up by then. I mean, we just need to have an abstract for that. But I've been working on this idea for a while. We're gonna do it for A Life, but couldn't get it, just couldn't do it. So
Right.
that's gonna go.
Okay.
And I know
Okay, well,
Brian
I'm
expressed some
definitely
interest. I don't know. Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
see.
If there's anything like that we can help look at or do, let us know. I'm very curious about that, and yeah, no, it's a good meeting. I like all the tangents. I will try to follow up for Amanda and find that podcast. Um, and I will probably be reaching out to a few people um, for New York Celebration Women Computing things ahead, but otherwise, um, good to hear from everybody and hope you're doing well, and I'll talk to you all next week.
Have a good week. Thank you.